Fallout New Vegas. One of the best games ever made. Certainly the best Western RPG ever made. In more ways than one. Also, yes, I have to specify Western, because anyone with common sense knows you do not under any circumstances try to argue with Final Fantasy or Fire Emblem fans if you value your life, sanity, or online career. I have loved the Fallout series ever since I crawled out of Vault 101, trying to pull an Uno reverse card by finding Liam Neeson with my particular set of skills. I loved it so much, in fact, that I played all the others and got the special edition pre-order for Fallout 4 that came with the lore book. Didn't get the Pip-Boy edition, sadly, but a college history student doesn't exactly have that kind of money just lying around. But of all the Fallout games I've played, none of them have hit like Fallout New Vegas. I know, I'm just another one of the million creators to point out the obvious, that it is the best in the franchise, or at least of the 3D Fallouts, if not the history of gaming. But for me, there is a very specific reason why. Of course, the other qualities that make the game a masterpiece are why I replay it every year, but what makes me love it to its core is of course the autistic obsession that I went to school for, and somehow made my career fanboying about on the internet. Due to the retro-futuristic setting of the Fallout universe and its lore, at its very foundation it is actually a historically themed period piece. The Americana of the McCarthy-era Red Scare is the series' core identity, which plays into its critique of the American identity, American history, and the very social fabric of America itself. Behind every single detail in this world, you will find a satirical jab at capitalism run wild, while politicians abuse the existential fear of the communist menace to seize more and more power for themselves. If you know a single thing about me as a person, you can probably see why this game series would be so addictive. I mean, Fallout 3 has an entire third of the game dedicated to the struggle of bringing clean water for all, restoring freedom to the enslaved, while saving the very identity of American democracy. You literally rescue the Declaration of Independence for a museum. Hell, if you do it right, you can destroy an entire cabal of slave traders with the righteous might of Abraham Lincoln's Henry Repeater. It's not exactly subtle what the game is trying to say. The Fallout series itself is a warning to reflect on our history, reflect on our society, and learn from our mistakes. There are historical references and outright historical theses hidden all over the Fallout games. All it takes is some digging. However, Fallout New Vegas is different. The historical references are not just in the fabric, they are the entire suit. And it's a much better suit than this asshole's. Its historical themes are worn on its sleeves, while the satire, as well as their critiques, are far more blatant, cutting to the very heart of every issue they tackle. But what sets it apart, and ultimately makes it the best game of the series, is the fact that it goes past the original conceit of analysing and satirising our society. Instead, it has the integrity and the sheer balls to take the next logical and far more difficult step. The first 3 games have shown you the problem. Fallout New Vegas turns to the player and asks, "Okay, smartass, so what's the solution?" And it is in one of the proposed solutions we find our subject for the day. For today, we're going to compare a fictional character with the man from whom he gets his name. Because across the Colorado River, in an empire built on the backs of its slaves, sitting atop a mountain of rotting corpses, stands the most obvious yet layered historical character in the entire Fallout franchise. An educated, a cultured, and civilized man. An NCR citizen, a follower of the apocalypse, a doctor of anthropology, and the worst genocidal mass murderer in the wasteland. His name is Edward Sallow. He is Caesar.
I used Imperial Rome as the model for my legion precisely because it was so foreign, so alien. I'd seen what had become of the NCR's attempts to emulate the culture of pre-war America, the infighting, the corruption. Rome was a highly militarized autocracy that effectively integrated the foreign cultures it conquered. It dedicated its citizens to something higher than themselves, to the idea of Rome itself. It means a nationalist, imperialist, totalitarian, homogeneous culture that obliterates the identity of every group it conquers. Long-term stability at all cost. The individual has no value beyond his utility to the state. whether as an instrument of war or production. In Rome, I found a template for a society equal to the challenges of the post-apocalyptic world, a society that could and would survive, a society that could prevent mankind from fracturing and destroying itself in this new world by establishing a new Pax Romana.
This video has kindly been sponsored by the world's fastest and most popular VPN service, NordVPN. We all need a VPN these days to keep us safe online. It's practically a requirement. And in the age of AI scam bots as well as big data harvesters, it's more vital than ever before. Thankfully, Nord, with its sleek, easy-to-use design, gives you the edge with absolutely no hassle. But they have so many quality-of-life features. Hell, Nord has an entire web page dedicated to what these threats are and how to handle them. Everything from guarding your critical data inside applications to the impacts of cyber warfare. Trust me, as a military YouTuber, that made me pleasantly surprised. And check out this interface. I can just click through all of these features. And of course, all the other features are there. Nord's Active Protection shields you from malware trackers and ads. Their inbuilt dark web monitor notifies you if someone steals your credentials. MeshNet allows you to connect up to 6 devices remotely and securely, and it comes with a dedicated IP that helps you avoid capacities and block lists. Basically, if you can think of what a VPN needs to do, it does it. And of course, they have 24/7 customer support, a dedicated app for every device, and right now you can get 4 months extra on a 2-year plan by clicking the link in the description below. They have a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you have literally nothing to lose by giving them a try. So give them a shot. Click the link in the description and get that special offer. Plus, you'll help the channel, and I'll appreciate all the help I can get. Now, back to the video. Before we start the video proper, I should let you know that it won't be as visually impressive as some of my other works, primarily because there weren't exactly a lot of cameras in ancient and classical Rome. That and New Vegas doesn't have a lot of cinematics, and there isn't a huge abundance of Caesar's Legion artwork compared to, say, the NCR. But I've done my best. Anyway, let's go. Caesar's Legion is my favourite faction in the Fallout franchise, and by extension, one of my favourites in all of fiction. Not because I identify or agree with their ideology and practices in any way, good lord no. If I may borrow a clip from another YouTuber.
So on the one hand, Caesar's rule with an iron power fist has brought stability to the lands he rules, and on the other, have you lost your mind? Fascists, you're trying to spin fascism. Why would you ever consider this a viable path to reconstruction?
However, they do provide, at least in my view, one of the best foils to a narrative in all of gaming, if not popular media in general. The Legion is a brutal society. When the player meets Volpe and Nipton, they are seen crucifying people on Stoby poles, torching entire villages while enslaving and annexing all they encounter. They are morally reprehensible in almost every regard, from their use of child soldiers to their treatment of women, reducing them to domestic slaves and breeding stock. The Legion is a complete rejection of all the core freedoms and values most of us hold as sacred and inviolable. But it's this very fact that shows us the brilliance of their design as well as their role within the narrative. To us, the players, they are an unthinkable descent into depravity and evil. Whereas NCR citizens from the core states, like Shady Sands, see them as barbaric tribals posing an existential threat to their way of life. But the material conditions of our nice, cushy liberal democracies are nowhere near the horrifying, chaotic violence of the wasteland. And the wastes of what was Arizona are the worst in post-war America. Or at least they were, until the Legion. Therein lies the conceit. Our views of the Legion are influenced by 2 overwhelming factors. First, our inherent biases due to our own lives and the utopian by comparison conditions we inhabit. And second, we aren't seeing the Legion in its totality. We aren't seeing the society at large. What we are seeing is the vanguard of an invading army engaged in total war. Their brutality and savagery are similar to what we see in every example of war humanity has ever fought. Even today, as you watch this video, just go on the news. Similar atrocities are being carried out in conflicts across the world right now, this very second. The only variation being that Caesar's violence is sanctioned and institutionalized, rather than quietly encouraged and then covered up as we see in modern militaries today. Yet despite this gulf of difference, the violence serves the same purpose. Terrorize the populace to ensure compliance, undermine enemy morale to compromise their combat performance, and most of all, instill fear. Raw, paralyzing fear. However, this fear comes with a cost. If you are too brutal, too uncompromising, the enemy will fight to the bitter end rather than submit. Thus, if an empire of this nature is to survive, it must offer an enticing alternative. As Sun Tzu so succinctly put it, when you surround an army, leave an outlet free. Do not push a desperate foe too hard, lest he find courage in despair. Caesar's legion, the same brutal hyper-authoritarian stratocracy that denies all liberty, in exchange provides complete and comprehensive security. To those of us in the pre-war world, the famous Benjamin Franklin quote, "Those who trade liberty for security deserve neither," definitely comes to mind. But the truth of the matter is, none of us, not even in old Benji's time, have faced anything like the post-nuclear horrors of the wasteland. And while the denizens of New Vegas and the NCR cities back west may share our view, had their great-grandparents scaping together a living in the boneyard as the Master's super mutant army started massing outside been posed the same question, I'm not sure their descendants would like the answer. Legion subjects, as they are known, are comprised of non-tribal communities inhabiting the territory conquered by the Legion during their various phases of expansion. While the Legion itself survives and expands by forcibly integrating raider gangs and tribal groups, non-tribal, or for lack of a better term, civilized communities are peacefully integrated into the Legion's economic framework. In return for a comparatively small percentage of their economic output, at least compared to NCR taxes, the Legion provides the logistics, manpower, and military protection to ensure a high quality of life for their subjects, a quality of life only matched by middle-class NCR citizens living in the big cities like Shady Sands, Vault City, or the Hub. They have guaranteed access to clean water, a strong network of trade caravans and couriers, providing a stable and lucrative economy, leading to a consistent food supply and, in the larger communities, a regular supply of electricity. The raiders, hostile wildlife, and environmental hazards that plague the post-nuclear world, even in developed areas like the NCR, are not a problem for Legion subjects, as the Legion has killed or integrated all the raiders while hunting down or domesticating all the dangerous wildlife, to the extent that trade caravans often don't even need guards in their lands. And while subjects don't have guaranteed rights like a citizen would, the ironclad laws and extreme discipline of the Legion means criminal activity, political corruption, and unauthorized brutality by Legion troops is essentially zero, with any violators being punished very severely. Of course, this all comes with the caveat that if Caesar says jump, you jump. But as long as you do jump, you are almost guaranteed to have a safe, productive, and even prosperous life. A fact lamented by NCR citizens like Cass, who, while unwilling to surrender their freedoms, acknowledge that for Wastelanders and even NCR citizens on the frontiers, as long as they aren't among the Legion's conscripts or slaves, life under the Legion would probably be better than the lives they have now. Sadly, much of this content is missing from the game, reducing the Legion to just stereotypical bad guys with a charismatic leader, trying to justify his atrocities by misquoting and misrepresenting Hegel.
This isn't Hegel, my friend! No! Thesis, antithesis, synthesis was thought up by Fichte, and it's clearly inferior to Hegel's dialectical method of immanent critique! Yes, it's called immanent critique, and dialectics is only one part of Hegel's full method, which again is called immanent critique, which you would know if you had actually bothered to read Hegel. It's literally in the science of logic, you dumb piece of shit!
But if you restore the cut content with mods, read the lore, and then fold it in with New Vegas' central discussions and themes, the Legion becomes a comprehensive critique of liberal democracy, an embodiment of extremes. It shows a successful, effective, and for some rather unpleasant people, perhaps even a preferable society for the post-nuclear world. But above all, it is a philosophical question posed to the player. In this horrific nightmare of a world, is hyper-utilitarianism the best way forward? Do the ends really justify the means? This is what makes them such a great narrative device. Plus, let's be real, the post-apocalyptic Roman LARP aesthetic is just really frickin' cool, and I'm tired of pretending it's not. But what kind of man creates this sort of society? What kind of man grows up among this desolation, looks at the lessons of history, reads about the classical world and 18th century philosophy and the fall of civilization both in past and present, while having the ambition, intellect, social position and sheer will to change the entire world in which he lives? Well, as the thumbnail and title of this video suggests, it's the same type of man who grew up in the aftermath of another war, under the tyranny of another master, who himself went out into what he perceived as a barbaric wasteland, acting with overwhelming brutality in a quest to further not just his own power, but to reshape and ultimately merge both their society and his own. Because the writers of Fallout, in this case Josh Sawyer and Chris Avallone, know their history. They knowingly crafted their character with thoughtful intent, and Edward Sallow shares more in common with his namesake Julius than most people realize. Hang on, wait a minute. Julius. Edward. Oh god, it's Jedward. 100 years before the birth of an even more famous JC, a young Roman patrician entered our world who would, despite all the odds and against the expectations of most of his peers, go down in history as one of the most important and indeed most infamous men to ever walk this earth. And much like his post-apocalyptic twin, the people who saw his rise did not heed the warning signs of the beast within, nor the cries of alarm from the few who did. Gaius Julius Caesar of the gens Julii was born into an auspicious house. His family had produced no less than 3 consuls.
He was a consul of Rome!
Unfortunately, the fortunes of politics, like the fortunes of war, are forever in flux, and by the time Gaius came around, they'd fallen to the rank of mere praetors and governors. Only 2 villas instead of the usual 4, and just 1 seaside trip to Ostia a month. All while being tutored by one of the most well-known scholars in Rome, Marcus Antonius Gnepho, the same man who tutored none other than the famous Marcus Tullius Cicero, as a point of fact. Truly a rough life to grow up in. However, in all seriousness, this privileged lifestyle came with an extreme amount of interest. It's just the young Gaius didn't know it yet. Oh, and by the way, we're going to keep calling him Gaius or Jules while we call the other one Jedward. If I do use Caesar or Caesar, I will use Caesar for the OG and Caesar for the cheap remaster. I know it's annoying, but if I don't specify this now, I'll be having to clarify every 5 seconds, and I'm probably going to mix them between each other anyway. So yeah, nah, disclaimer, not doing it, can't be asked. Anyway, back to the story. The reason he had to pay interest on that privilege was old mate Gaius, as mentioned before, was the son of Gaius Julius the Elder, praetor of Rome and governor of Asia. Now, while not a consul, praetor is near the top of the cursus honorum. That, by the way, is the system which gauges how far up the pecking order you are in the Roman system of politics, and he was near the top in terms of rank. Furthermore, as governor of Asia, he had some of the wealthiest provinces to levy taxes from, as well as access to the most exotic of trade goods. So how does someone who isn't already exceedingly wealthy or supremely powerful get such a good position? The answer, of course, is the same as it is in our world. You gotta have friends in the right places, and the Julii most definitely had friends in the right places. You see, Roman politics was split into 2 major factions who made up the representation in the Senate. The populares, rich old men allegedly fighting the cause of the average pleb, while actually serving their own interests and embezzling state contracts to make themselves richer, aka the Democrats, versus the optimates, rich old men actually fighting the fight of the wealthy and powerful, while allegedly being pious conservatives, upholding the traditions that made Rome great, despite being completely corrupt degenerates coasting off old glories long gone, aka the Republicans. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And before everyone complains in the comments, yes, I know it's not a direct comparison, and it's more complicated than that, and there are a million different socioeconomic factors that aren't being considered, but this is a YouTube video, not a doctoral thesis, and this makes it easier for everyone who isn't a basement-dwelling nerd like us to understand. Moving on! The Julii, being a wealthy patrician family of long-standing lineage, would normally be aligned with the optimates, and indeed half of them were. The issue was, though, as mentioned before, that they constantly moved up and down in society with their changing fortunes. They didn't have the long-term stability that some of the more distinguished houses like the Cornelia or the Brutii had, meaning they more often than not had found allies in the Popularis faction who were closer to them in the class-based pecking order most of the time. This turned out to be a fantastic move, in fact, because it led to an alliance of marriage by Gaius's aunt to one of Rome's greatest men, and when I say greatest, I mean it. This man was a big deal. You see, by the time Jules Jr. was born, Rome was no longer the mighty republic that felled Carthage. Rome had reached the point where the old systems that kept their state going for centuries had started to break down, unable to support the fledgling empire that was starting to form. They had a bunch of provinces all over the place. They had Greece, they had Spain, they had Africa, they had everything going on. It just couldn't cope. But the man who had kept it together through 6 terms as consul, the man who had fought back multiple barbarian hordes from the north while putting down rebellious Italian tribes that threatened Rome's very existence. A man who actually came from a working class background, a genuine working class hero who worked his way up through the ranks in the army, eventually serving as tribune of the plebs and then consul, where he pushed through electoral reforms limiting the voting power of the wealthy. But most famously of all, he was the man who reformed the army into a professional standing force that allowed transcontinental power projection for the state while providing social mobility for all citizens. The first ever modern army. That man was Gaius Marius the Elder, or, for the sake of torturing a metaphor, Bernie Sanders, sponsored by Raytheon. Gaius's uncle by marriage was the single most powerful populares in Rome, which meant Julius the Younger was on the fast track into the upper echelons of the plebeian faction right from the outset, which ultimately led him to meeting the other big man in the populares arena, Lucius Cornelius Cinna, aka Barack Obama, sponsored by the Dark Brotherhood. Cinna was a progressive candidate, similar to Marius, but while Marius was a man who largely won his battles very literally, Cinna was a mostly political animal and had quite the Machiavellian streak. Upon meeting the young Gaius Julius, Cinna immediately took a liking to the boy. He was well educated, intelligent, but most of all, extremely driven. He had a knack for the martial skills so prized in Rome, while also being well read, not to mention politically astute. Perhaps sensing greatness, or perhaps sensing a useful future pawn, Cinna offered his daughter's hand in marriage to the young Caesar, which he most graciously accepted, along with an appointment to the Temple of Jupiter as a priest, a highly honoured and advantageous position, both politically and academically. But the good times were not to last, as before his 16th birthday, his father, Gaius Julius Caesar the Elder, died of a heart attack while putting his shoes on. And as if that wasn't bad enough, civil war had come to Rome. For you see, while all this was happening, the Republic was in utter political chaos. There are an entire series of books on this one period of Roman history, and the political dealings as well as the military campaigns are absolutely insane. It would take me a million videos to cover all this, and while I have a classics education, I'm much better at modern military history. That being said, let's have a go at giving you the short version. After the failed uprising by the Italian tribes known as the Social War, the populares were trying to put forward multiple reforms regarding citizenship and the electoral process, which would allow more plebeians to vote while inducting the non-Roman Italians as citizens. This would de-escalate ethnic tensions, boost the strength of the populares considerably in the Senate, as well as being a fantastic PR move. Much like how populist and progressive parties push for similar policies today to boost their votes in the migrant communities while also shoring up their base of support. And just like today, this made the conservative factions, as well as all of the optimates, very, very mad. But, given all the power the populares had amassed with Marius' support, they couldn't do very much about it. That is, until King Mithridates of Pontus invaded the eastern provinces, which means an army needed to be formed to counter him, and while Marius was the popular general, he was also an old man. So, seeing their opportunity, the optimates appointed the command of the army to a younger man, and he was also the big player in their faction, one Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Oh boy. Sulla was an absolute powerhouse of a man. Like Marius, he had been born poor, but unlike Marius, he came from the esteemed Cornelian branch of Rome's old families, meaning he was afforded opportunities as an optimate that others wouldn't have. Using that name to his advantage, he got a decent education which led to a commission in the legions. Once in the military, Sulla distinguished himself under the command of none other than Marius himself. In fact, it was a source of much contention in the press that Sulla had won half of Marius's battles for him, and the general just took the credit. Sulla was just that good on the battlefield. So good, in fact, that he got elected consul in 89 BC. There are other discussions to be had about the man, but if nothing else, there is one thing to be said. He was a man of pure, unadulterated ambition and drive, and it appeared his moment had come. Command of a full-sized army to fight a brutal war on the fringes of the Empire's most wealthy conquests against a mighty and worthy foe. It was an illustrious post, which, if he excelled in it, he would almost certainly achieve great wealth and a second consulship, along with enough reputation to wield immense political influence. Except the Populares faction, led by the tribune of the plebs, Publius Sulpicius Rufus, staged a miniature coup against the Optimates and had Sulla stripped of his command, which was then transferred to Marius. However, there was one teeny tiny little issue with that plan. That being that Sulla had already taken command of the army, and he was only a couple days' march away from Rome. Oops. I'm pretty sure you can guess how this went. After a short but fierce battle, Sulla's troops defeated the militia Marius had formed to protect the city, before marching to the Senate House, much to the disgust of the citizenry, who threw rocks at them as they went. But despite the hostile reception, Sulla had an army, and, well, they didn't. Marius's family were declared outlaws, his command was reinstated, and his coup d'etat declared a legal act against political corruption. Tribune Rufus got caught and killed, but the Marians made their escape to Africa. With that little issue resolved, Sulla mustered his men, reorganized, raised a few more cohorts, and left Rome to fight Mithridates. But he'd made a crucial error. He dealt with Marius, sure, but he'd missed Cinna, who, once the opportunity presented itself, would surely strike, and strike he most definitely did. The moment Sulla left Rome, Cinna immediately moved to get elected consul, which, thanks to his friendship with Marius and the unpopularity of the Optimates given Sulla's active tyranny, he won by a landslide. But you see, the Roman Republic has a check against consular power, that being the requirement for 2 consuls at the same time, so one can cancel out the other, which led to Gaius Octavius, the Optimate candidate, being appointed as co-consul. Hopefully this would stop anything crazy happening. Anyway, Cinna immediately introduced legislation to have Sulla declared a traitor to the state for his actions, stripped of his command, and blocked from holding any government office ever again, while also reintroducing all the radical reforms that caused this whole crisis in the first place. You know, nothing major. However, Sulla, lest we forget, literally the last paragraph of this script ago, has the army already, and so his response to this was, and I quote, "Lol, no." Quickly followed by him sailing to Greece to go win his other war. With this plan unceremoniously foiled, Cinna decided that if he couldn't go after Sulla directly, he'd hit at his power base instead. So, remember all those electoral reforms along with the citizenship awards to Italians and migrants? Yeah, well, Cinna made that his priority goal for his consulship instead, which drove the conservatives absolutely insane. Gaius Octavius said that giving all these non-Romans power would destabilize the government. It would cause a rise in crime. What will we do about the minority populations? Blah, 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 blah. If you've watched at least 10 minutes of Fox News, you know how this went. This led to the 2,000-year prequel of Antifa versus the Proud Boys, as Populares and Optimate gangs started battling in the streets. Which is exactly what Cinna was betting on. Because Cinna had practically changed his name to Georgius Sorostius, there was now huge amounts of public disorder in Rome. This meant that Octavius would almost certainly have to put his foot down, which he did, authorizing his tribunes with emergency powers to ensure the survival of the state while mobilizing a militia to put down the riots, making him the tyrannical bad guy. And you'll never guess what happened next. Cinna skipped town in the middle of the night, called Marius and the boys back from Africa, and then marched on Rome to depose the tyrants. Sure enough, with the support of the great Marius, Cinna came back to Rome at the head of an army, until he was confronted by none other than Pompey Strabo, father of a promising young officer in the legions by the name of Gnaeus Pompey the Younger.
Here I come. Oh, here I come. Oh.
The beginnings of a siege began until it became clear that with all the electoral and citizen reforms, Cinna had the support of the Italian tribes in the region, most prominently the Samnites. With their help, Cinna and the Populares would easily be able to overcome the Senate's now dwindling forces. And so the conquering heroes marched into the Eternal City to liberate them from the tyrannical Optimates. And they liberated them by immediately declaring martial law and killing all their political enemies.
I love democracy. I love the Republic.
Among those political enemies included Publius Licinius Crassus, father of Marcus, and Marcus Antonius the Elder, grandfather of Mark Antony. But the really funny part is that while the Julii were allied with the Populares, class-wise they were Optimates, and so several of Caesar's relatives copped it in the neck too. Speaking of Jules, actually, he was watching all of this with great trepidation. He had just gotten it made. He was in the golden years of his life. He had a hot, rich wife, a key position in society, his uncle was back in power, and his father-in-law is the sole consul, seeing as Octavius met an unfortunate accident. However, being a man of supreme ambition himself, Gaius Julius knew that if he was put in this position, he wouldn't take such a gross challenge to his authority or security lying down. With Marius in control of Rome, he knew Sulla would be pissed. Sure enough, fast forward a couple years, Sulla had defeated and subsequently struck a deal with Mithridates to finance his campaign against Marius in exchange for recognition as a Roman ally with all the privileges that affords. Meanwhile, back in Italy, the Optimates had rallied together and begun organizing, among them Pompey the Younger. The First Roman Civil War had begun in earnest, and it was brutal. Battles raged across the entire Italian peninsula, which, as I said, fill entire books. But eventually, Sulla reached the gates of Rome itself and defeated the Marian forces defending it. Man, it feels like Roman politicians with an army is a bad idea. It seems to lead to a regime change quite a lot. But after Sulla cleans up this mess and centralizes power, I'm sure it won't be a problem.
In the business, we call this foreshadowing.
Speaking of cleaning up, actually, you will never guess what Sulla did next. Because if Cinna and Marius did a Night of the Long Knives, Sulla was essentially Stalin, and oh baby, it was purging time. But now, finally, after that mammoth of a detour, we are back to the actual subject of the video, because Sulla had issued his prescriptions, essentially allowing him to murder hundreds, if not thousands of citizens, while seizing all their financial assets. And the best part is, he doesn't even have to do it himself with his own men. The citizens of Rome can turn them in for a bounty. And as the nephew of Marius and Cinna's son-in-law, guess who is first in line for the chopping block? Caesar was smart enough to know that his chances of survival were very low if he stayed in Rome. So, his plan of escape was to do what all young men facing imminent criminal conviction or life problems do. Join the Legion and go on deployment. Distinguishing himself as a war hero while fighting under Sulla's regime, as well as getting as much geographical distance between him and said dictator, was his best shot at survival. This also had the added bonus of getting him up the cursus honorum, making him eligible for senior Senate posts should he get elected. And with his lineage and a heroic war record, that was a slam dunk. Or perhaps a thumbs up would be a more appropriate sporting metaphor in this case. But having a plan is one step, the first step. The next step is carrying it out, and first to do that, he had to get out of Rome, which meant getting past Sulla. Now, there are some very famous legends that the two met face to face and had a verbal showdown, but the more realistic assessment is that the Gens Julii had very senior representatives among some of the Optimates who supported Sulla, and they campaigned for his removal from the prescription lists. The fact Caesar lived through this whole process proves that their efforts were successful, though some of them probably regretted their decision to help him later. The deal was, he had to resign his post as a priest of Jupiter and leave Rome immediately. The original demand included a provision that he would have to divorce his wife, but Caesar wouldn't budge on that score. If nothing else, he was definitely a man of conviction. a man who was now alive and very lucky to be so, leaving Rome to take up his post in the Legion. And though his life, as stated before, is full of propaganda and legends, there is one legend I choose to believe, and it is in fact the most famous one. That being what Sulla said after he signed Caesar's pardon. He expressed concern and even regret the moment he signed it, remarking to his lieutenant Gnaeus Pompey, "In that man I see many a Marius," predicting that his ambition combined with his talent would soon bring calamity to Rome. If only the people of the 23rd century had such foresight. Edward Sallow was born in the year 2226 among the ruins of Los Angeles on the outskirts of what had come to be known as the Boneyard. The circumstances of his birth and his social status are not well known, probably by Jedward's own design. But what we do know that is he was born an NCR citizen to an upstanding, semi-prominent family in his community. However, like his historical counterpart, he lost his father at a young age. In his case, a much younger age, as when he was just 2 years old, his father was killed during a raider attack on his settlement. Their primary income having been unceremoniously terminated in the most brutal fashion possible, Jedward's mother took refuge with their local chapter of the Followers of the Apocalypse, a humanitarian organization dedicated to preserving the academic and scientific advances of the past in order to share them with all post-war survivors, providing education, engineering support, and medical services wherever they reside, thereby restoring the torch of enlightenment to humanity. In exchange for her labour, Jedward's mother was given a safe place to live and raise her child, who would receive a full education and upbringing inside the organization, both as an NCR citizen and as a follower. This was the decisive moment of not just his life, but for the very future of the entire North American continent, as this would give him both a privileged upbringing and a first-rate education, like his historical counterpart. But his life would actually, rather ironically given he lives in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, would be a lot more stable, yet move a hell of a lot faster. Growing up as a follower inside the NCR, Jedward received what amounted to a private school education. He had to pass state-mandated topics about NCR history, civics, math, and literacy, but he also got taught subjects only followers or Brotherhood of Steel scribes got taught: science, technology, history, engineering. For most of the denizens of the post-nuclear world, skills needed to succeed in life are usually vocational. People learn how to work on computers, run a workshop, or learn a trade from their parents through an apprenticeship or simply by community necessity. By being raised essentially from birth as a follower, Jedward was far better educated across every single discipline, both practical and theoretical. Therefore, he was at least proficient in every essential skill, from weapons maintenance to survivalism to bartering. But even at that young age, he stood out from his peers with his intellect as well as his athleticism. Again, we don't have specifics, but from what can be gathered, as a teenager he participated in the defense of his settlement, demonstrated clear leadership abilities, and was very diligent in mastering martial as well as organizational skills. He was also, if rumors are to be believed, considered quite handsome by the women of the community. However, there were significant trade-offs to these skills in terms of his personality. As with most male leadership types, the same confidence and talent that made him excel in almost all things gave him an egotistical conceit of immense proportions, while his image of the roguish warrior scholar made him insufferably vain. He was petulant, bad-tempered, and by the time he came of age he considered the academic slog of higher learning beneath his talents. People respected his abilities, that's true, but he was also very unpopular. Literally, nobody liked him as a person. Throughout his entire education, he had shown aptitude for just about every single subject he took, but he only ever excelled in 2 or 3, for the simple reason that the other subjects bored him, and he considered them beneath his efforts. And what were those few good subjects, you ask? Well, of course, they were history, philosophy, and civics. Jedward was a voracious reader. He had read every surviving history book in the Follower's archive, which was a vast collection given that the Follower headquarters in the Boneyard was none other than the remarkably well-preserved LA Central Library. But this dedication to learning, so treasured by the Followers, was not what it seemingly appeared. The scholars and professors observing these skills for archival research, deciphering the mysteries of past cultures and civilizations, the ability to understand their traditions, beliefs, and languages, led them to training Jedward as an anthropologist. But their assessment of his interest in these subjects was a tragically catastrophic misinterpretation. The future Caesar had read all these books. True. He had learned all the lessons they had hoped he would learn, but like many alienated young men with an inflated sense of self-importance, he had drawn the entirely opposite conclusion. The followers and their enlightened, optimistic, almost anarcho-communist approach to rebuild civilization was not seen by Jedward as a noble goal for which to strive, but a naive road to failure. The followers thought they had created a hard-headed but ultimately dedicated academic. No. What they'd actually created was a Hearts of Iron 4 player without a PC that could run it. And he viewed the people who raised him with utter contempt. In his mind, they were on the road to ruin. They lacked his ambition, his drive, and more importantly, the will to do what needed to be done to bring civilization back to humanity. He had grown up in the waning days of President Tandy's reign as president of the NCR. And thanks to his rare education, he had seen the oncoming storm before they even saw it themselves. Corporate greed, political corruption, inequitable distribution of both power and wealth, food shortages, a rising drug trade, and the beginnings of a military-industrial complex. He had been taught growing up that a liberal democracy based in old-world values was the best way forward, only to see its outright failures every day of his life. If there was one lesson he had learned through all of his reading as well as his own life experiences, losing his father to raiders, growing up in a world scorched by nuclear fire, watching the so-called greatest nation in the wasteland slowly start to fall apart, it was that societal change, hell, civilization itself, comes from the proper application of force. From understanding the material conditions that drive human society and harnessing those conditions to effect the change you want to see. But despite this revelation, he was still just a lowly scribe tied down to a bunch of hippies holed up in a library with no direction in life or long-term goals. But all of that was about to change. In 2246, the NCR was rapidly expanding eastwards towards Nevada and the Grand Canyon. The followers, being ever eager to spread their utopian mission wherever possible, wanted to make sure the communities encountered in the region were documented, studied, and communicated with before the new wave of manifest destiny hit them. Thus, they needed to send an expedition to learn the various tribal dialects of the area while setting up a new forward outpost. For this mission, they decided to send their most talented anthropological linguist, the now 20-year-old Jedward. For the young man, though disillusioned, this was the moment that he had been waiting for. He was tired of being frustrated by the endless academic trifle that had long since outlived its usefulness. He was finally going to go do actual work, a mission in the field, facing the harsh dangers of the wasteland, actually writing history instead of simply reading it. Joined by a trained physician, Bill Calhoun, and a small retinue of 9 support staff, the expedition set out into the rising sun, not knowing what they would find. But for the young 20-year-old member of their group, all he found was bitter disappointment. The people they found were either small settlements of settlers scraping together a living on the frontier, or tribals with very limited communication skills, simple linguistic structures, and a way of life that could only be described as barbaric. They were inferior, pathetic beings, living in squalor while committing atrocities to no purpose at all. The young Jedward, once enthused with the thrill of adventure, was now disillusioned beyond simple disenchantment. He was outright furious. What was this mission, other than a horrific waste of time? These people barely deserved the name people. Their languages were inelegant, primitive, no, downright vulgar. They lived and behaved like savages. There was no nobility or beauty in these primitive cultures, just the reminder that the once mighty civilizations of times past had fallen into catastrophic ruin, their descendants now nothing but animals, vultures even, picking over a carcass of a much greater time. This whole exercise was pointless. Yet there was nothing he could do. He was trapped by his circumstances, and he had no idea how to find his way out. However, fate would extend its hand and provide him an answer. An answer found in the writings of our other protagonist. While searching a ruined town for supplies, the followers found something they could never resist: a local library. Sure, it was small compared to their headquarters in the Boneyard, but being so far away from major cities or military targets, it was almost completely intact. And buried in the storage sections, filled with the return boxes, shielded from the elements, was a veritable treasure trove of hundreds of pre-war books, all of them perfectly preserved. And given that he was the expedition's lead scribe and translator, Jedward was the one assigned to catalogue what they'd found and take the most valuable books for transport. He immediately began sorting through them: poetry books, children's books, fiction novels, tossed aside as useless nonsense. He then began finding engineering and science texts, as well as philosophy. These were useful, so after sorting duplicate copies of books he knew the Boneyard had, he started packing them up. It was then, among the boxes and shelves, he found the history section, which, to his delight, was fully intact. He grabbed all that he could find, and as he did, a pair of books fell from the stack: The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, and none other than the Commentarii Belli de Gallico by Julius Caesar, or Commentaries on the Gallic Wars. As the expedition set up their base camp in the surviving town buildings, every spare moment Jedward had was spent reading. He started with Rise and Fall, and once he'd begun, he simply could not stop. He learned about Rome before in other books he had read growing up. Between his two loves of military history and Grognak the Barbarian, he couldn't really avoid it. But now he had the full story, from start to finish, to fill in the gaps. It was all there in those pages. How the Roman world, a civilization much like the mighty United States of America, the republic which birthed his own, had fallen into decay and destruction on a scale so unfathomable. How a globe-spanning empire could lose its virtue, its direction, its meaning, and ultimately itself. He could draw the parallels, make the connections. He had in his hand the blueprint for how democracies die. But more importantly, he had the blueprint for how empires are born. He was captivated, inspired even. But as he would go on to say later, nothing could prepare him for the writings of Julius Caesar. He spent 2 weeks holed up in the library, ostensibly cataloguing, but actually reading, rereading, devouring Gaius's exploits. He saw much of his own life in what he saw: a privileged upbringing, a stifling tyranny over his youth, a man of passion, willpower and drive trapped in a failing society. Yet this same man, despite all the odds being against him, found in those odds an opportunity. The wilds of Gaul and Britain, the cutthroat politics of Rome, the rampaging civil wars in the East, throughout all of these he came, he saw, and he conquered. Edward Sallow, the young follower of the apocalypse, listless academic malcontent, came out of those 2 weeks a changed man. Julius Caesar had achieved the heights of power, accomplished feats that were almost superhuman. He had marched across the known world, shaping it to his will, while bringing civilization to savage barbarians. In this, Jedward saw his path. All the frustrations and melancholic ruminations that had cursed his life were wiped clean in an instant. The wasteland was a harsh, anarchic place, but in that anarchy an individual could find opportunity, and with that opportunity he could pursue his vision. It is a supreme irony that he would later quote Hegel as his inspiration, because his course of action suggests not a Hegelian argument, but a far more bearded analysis. History is a dialectic defined by material conditions, but unlike Hegel, the point is not to merely understand this dialectic. The point is to change it. Edward Sallow was a man with a mission. All he needed was that opportunity. And in another humorous twist of fate, he shared that opportunity with Gaius Julius Caesar. Back in the Sullan dictatorship, our old friend Gaius has skipped town with his missus and his household slaves to take up a position on the general staff of the governor of Asia, one Marcus Minucius Thermus. During his tenure there, he distinguished himself as a soldier of exceptional talent, quickly working his way up to be one of the governor's most trusted aides. If there was a serious issue, it was Gaius who got sent to deal with it. This allowed him to build quite the network of influential people in the eastern provinces. During one particularly nasty border war, he was sent to meet Nicomedes IV, king of Bithynia, to get naval reinforcements. Once this was done, he was invited to stay as a guest of the court. Having powerful friends is always a useful thing.
They also may have been boning, but historians are still divided on that.
But you still need glory in battle to get true status in Roman society. Luckily enough, though, being an officer in the legion posted to Asia gives you a lot of opportunities to get it. On the island of Lesbos, yes, that one, in 81 BC, the city of Mytilene revolted against Roman rule. Governor Thermus dispatched his troops to retake the island and crush the rebels, and among the command staff was Gaius Julius Caesar. The battle to retake the city was fierce, eventually leading to an all-out assault over the walls. But, like his post-apocalyptic successor, Gaius himself was quite the talented warrior. He was, in fact, part of the vanguard, and during this action he saved the life of a fellow officer while fighting with great bravery and distinction, ultimately leading to a Roman victory. This led to the man he saved nominating him for, and subsequently being awarded, the Civic Crown, the second highest decoration an officer in the Legion can win. This was a huge honour, and it conferred similar benefits that the Medal of Honor or Victoria Cross confers today regarding status and rank, such as being saluted while wearing it, as well as special honours and privileges on state holidays. But the big thing it did was give Caesar a massive boost in his planned political career, because he would be able to wear it during public events, marking him out as a hero of the Republic, which always looks good in the press. It was then Christmas came 78 years early, as Sulla.exe stopped working, and there was much rejoicing. That means he can go back home to Rome and get his shit back. He can also start a career in politics, get to climbing that cursus honorum for real this time. But once he got there, things didn't exactly go that great. You see, for one of the few times in his life, Caesar made a grave strategic and tactical error. He started his political career by going after all of Sulla's lieutenants in court for violating his civil rights. This was particularly dicey because A, lawyering in Rome was a dangerous profession, and B, the formal consul Lepidus was getting rather feisty. You see, when Sulla died, an emergency government was formed to rule Rome in the interim. Among them was consul Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who, as a major player in the Populares faction, immediately went on the warpath, attempting to get Sulla declared a tyrant, have all his laws and reforms repealed, bring back all the exiled Marian faction members, and pass huge sweeping legislation, essentially bringing in a codified welfare system for the plebs. Now, all of that sounds wonderful on paper, but the problem was, these actions caused serious unforeseen consequences. As if Marius was Bernie Sanders sponsored by Raytheon, these policies and reforms turned him into AOC sponsored by Northrop Grumman, meaning his activism sparked a new wave of radicalism, leading to them revolting against the Senate. So he did the responsible thing. He went down there to try and calm them down like any decent liberal politician would do, only for them to proclaim him their leader and savior, and then demand he defeat the corrupt oligarchs in Rome. This led to him being branded a traitor, and so he did what any self-respecting Roman politician does in this situation and, say it with me now, marched on Rome with an army. But this wasn't no small tin pot revolt. Oh no, he had some rather illustrious supporters in his ranks. Among his supporters in this endeavour were Cinna's son and the heir to the Brutii family, Marcus Junius Brutus, who had recently become a father. I wonder what his son will end up doing. Wait a minute, is he playing with a knife? Anyway, while they were marching on the city, they sent envoys to gather support from the city's patricians, one of whom went to Caesar. Don't know what it said, Have no idea if the text survives or not, probably not. We get most of this from Plutarch, Cassius Dio, etc. But it probably went along the lines of, "Yo, step bro, what up? It's me, your boy Cinna the Younger. Wanna come help me overthrow the government?" To which Caesar, having just gotten home from being exiled on potential treason charges, said, and I quote again, "Yeah, nah." He had just been through crushing a revolt and had enough military experience to know what happens to an armed mob led by a politician. Sure enough, a real soldier showed up. Guess who? Gnaeus Pompey, soon-to-be but not yet Magnus, who immediately outmaneuvered them, leading to a complete defeat resulting in their execution, except Cinna the Younger, because Gaius, the absolute legend that he is, bailed his brother-in-law out. But as you can imagine, after using up some favours to save his brother-in-law while trying to sue prolific members of the aristocracy, immediately after an attempted coup against them, yeah, he wasn't having much luck. He needed to get some more experience in politics as well as some more street cred. Sure, he was a war hero, but he hadn't done much else besides getting nepo-babied into high office, thanks to the man partly responsible for starting the whole civil war which got everyone into this mess. So he decided if he was going to get into this public political figure business, he was going to need some proper training. And he would get it from the classical world's greatest scholar in law, as well as rhetoric, the great Molon of Rhodes, who, unsurprisingly, lived in Rhodes. Thus, Caesar boarded a ship and set sail eastwards once again, and he had big plans for the future. Plans about to be rudely interrupted by a band of Cretan pirates who seized their vessel and held the young patrician for ransom. They usually got a good price for Romans. Now, I should preface that the following story is most likely embellished, but it does have a good demonstration of Gaius's character. When the pirates sent out for ransom, they originally asked for 10 talents, which was the going rate for minor Roman nobles. But upon hearing this, the young Caesar scoffed in indignation. You kidding? 10 talents, is that all? He got to his feet and loudly proclaimed that he was worth 50 at least, and was insulted at being priced so low. No sooner had the ship departed to collect the ransom, Gaius walked around the camp, lecturing the pirates on their various flaws. He critiqued their weapons handling, he judged their food, berated their hygiene. Some versions of the tale even go so far as to say that he instructed them, helped them to improve, raised them up to aspire for better, but I think that's going a little bit too far. What is for certain was this. Caesar promised on his word of honour that the moment he was released he would raise both a fleet and a legion for the sole purpose of coming right back here to get his money back, at which point he would crucify them all on principle. The pirates stared in disbelief at this little brat, and then began laughing at the gall of this young Roman whelp. But Gaul for Caesar was just a province on his to-do list, because sure enough, once his ransom was paid, he fulfilled his promise. He got his money back, and they got a cross each for their trouble. Though, as a sign of mercy for their good treatment of him, he ordered their throats cut first. If nothing else, it made clear to everyone throughout the world, Gaius Julius Caesar keeps his promises. He would end up spending the next few years in Rhodes, studying the arts of rhetoric and law. While there, however, one of his relatives in the College of Pontiffs died while holding his post, and given Caesar's public profile as well as his education, he was selected as the replacement for this office, which was a great honour and yet another feather in his cap, or rather his wreath. It appeared he'd been singled out as a particular rising star. Once he returned to Rome to take up his office, he also ran for the position of military tribune, which he won quite convincingly. This placed him in charge of what amounted to Rome's logistics command at the same time as Spartacus's revolt, meaning that he was the guy organizing the supply lines and working directly with the generals, leading the fight against the rebellious gladiators. And just who were those generals? Well, their names were Marcus Licinius Crassus and Gnaeus Pompey Magnus. That's right, it's the triumvirate, baby! Although not yet. Caesar wasn't quite important enough to make a play like that at this stage. But Meeting these two men while in this role would, as we know, prove very, very useful. Indeed, once they got back from crushing the gregarious gladiators, Caesar made sure to align himself with the conquering hero Pompey by supporting his election to consul, as well as his policies in the Senate. Most notably, reforms favouring veterans, because if there is one thing you should have learned in watching this video by now, it's that as a Roman politician, your first task is to get the army on your side, in case things get, as they say these days, proportional. In return for his loyalty, Pompey and Crassus appointed Caesar as quaestor in southern Spain. Before he could leave on this assignment, though, tragedy struck as both his Aunt Julia and wife Cornelia passed away, leaving him the single father of his daughter Julia. Ever the practical man, though, Caesar used the very public funerals of his aunt and wife to memorialize Marius and Cinna as well, heroes of the Republic, defamed and destroyed by the tyrant Sulla, robbed of their own public funerals. However, he, the noble and pious Gaius Julius Caesar, priest of Jupiter, pontiff of the college, would set this injustice before the gods right. As a Julian, Caesar knew how to work the religious angle. His family claimed to be descended from Aeneas of Troy, the mythological founder of Rome, and son of Aphrodite, or Venus in the Roman pantheon, technically making him the direct descendant of a god. It was a fantastic PR move, as was his service in Spain, which was exceptional. But the real crowning moment was the choice of his new wife, a woman by the name of Pompeia, who was, of all people, Sulla's granddaughter. Not only was the young Caesar a hero of Rome, not only was he a just and pious man doing the Republic's work out in the colonies, but he was also on a quest to reunite the warring houses of the Republic, to make us all true Romans once again. Honestly, in all of history, I don't think there has been a better politician than Gaius Julius Caesar. He knew his public, and from here it was off to the races. In Caesar's case, quite literally, because with his climb up the cursus honorum underway, the next step on his appointment was aedile. An aedile was responsible for, public works, hosting events and games, organising the bureaucracy of the city. It was a very powerful role. And while he was serving in that role, he used his influence to help get Pompey assigned as basically the supreme commander of all Roman forces in the Eastern Mediterranean, meaning all anti-piracy operations and the wars against the Eastern kings, including Mithridates again, all of them were under his command, which, you guessed it, gets him all the credit for any victories won in them. In return, Caesar got support from Pompey in all his political maneuvers, as well as funding for lavishly expensive public events, including games, festivals, and feasts. But the best part is, at these games, what did Caesar do? Well, you know what he did. He restored all the monuments and triumphs of Marius. He was my uncle, by the way. Did I mention that Marius was my uncle? What a guy he was! All this relentless yet calculated self-promotion was expensive, and it put him in huge debt. But Caesar was ambitious, and the ambitious men are also gambling men. This was all setting up for him to make his big play for power. He was going to do a double whammy, something practically unheard of in Roman politics. He was going to run for praetor, the gateway to consular rank and a governorship, while at the same time running for Pontifex Maximus, the head of the Roman religion. This is like running for Pope and Vice President in the same campaign season. Pure insanity. And he pulled it off. Just, what was this man made of? It's insane. I mean, actually, there was a little hiccup in the middle here when the Catiline conspiracy played out, when some guy named Catiline, who ran for consul several times and lost, got together with a bunch of other failed politicians, raised an armed mob, and, well... Can anyone say it for me? I'm tired of saying it. No? Yes, alright. He marched on Rome, because of course he did. Unfortunately for him, Marcus Tullius Cicero found out about the coup and tipped off the Senate, who immediately arrested the conspirators who hadn't already left Rome. Caesar, having been recently elected praetor, once again proved that he was a master of controlling public opinion, and he delivered yet another political masterstroke, when he said that all the conspirators should be given a fair trial, pending exile or life imprisonment. Yes, the evildoers must be punished, but surely you must understand that these are our fellow Romans, not some lowly barbarians or foreigners, or some criminal, some common thief to be gutted on the Aventine. No. We must show mercy. This stance won him a lot of popularity with the populares, the voting public, and the more moderate optimates, who themselves didn't really want to set a precedent for murdering treasonous senators for obvious reasons. Caesar's political opponents tried to frame him for this leniency as a co-conspirator with the traitors, most notably Cato the Younger. But that didn't stick. Call him the Teflon Tribune. Huh? Wait, that joke doesn't work anymore. Fuck! In his role as praetor, Caesar spent the majority of his time in the Senate doing what he did best: maneuvering about while staying popular with the public. He found ways to screw over his rivals while looking like a hero, upholding Rome's best virtues. He constantly acted as a voice of reason in the Senate's more vicious debates, using his clout as a patrician to curry favour with the less radical optimates, while upholding the interests of the populares and the plebs. Man was riding that centrist patriot grift like no tomorrow. There was a brief scandal, though, due to him being Pontifex Maximus and praetor simultaneously, as his wife was involved in a traditional ceremony celebrating the goddess of chastity, Bonadia. As such, during the period in which this was observed, all men must vacate the pontifical villa, leaving only the Vestal virgins, ladies-in-waiting, and female slaves. During this religious holiday, though, a fellow patrician who apparently had romantic designs on Caesar's wife snuck into the villa, violating the sanctity of the rite as well as profaning the virginal vestry. When he was caught, the uproar was immense. The Senate called for the man's head. But once again, Caesar spoke up for the defense. Now, you may be wondering why he would defend a man planning to steal his girl. The answer is, of course, he was playing the crowd. For the patrician in question was Publius Claudius Pulcher, and he had relatives in high positions throughout the Republic. He was also a debtor, adulterer, accused of just about every white-collar crime imaginable, but also rather charismatic and good at parties. In short, he was absolute prime blackmail material. Caesar and his benefactor, Marcus Licinius Crassus, rigged the jury and bailed him out, meaning they had a popular patrician of senior rank in their back pocket with enough mud to smear on half the Senate if they wanted. Absolutely genius. And again, the masterstroke came from Caesar himself, because on the beginnings of the scandal, he divorced his wife Pompeia, but the reason he gave was that she must be regarded beyond suspicion. She will not be tarnished with any crime, nor shall the office of Pontifex Maximus be violated. Absolutely incredible move. Once again, against all the odds, he turned the entire situation around. Here he was, the noble Caesar, defending his wife's honour like any good husband should, preserving the dignity of Rome above his own, and now he was an eligible bachelor on the way up, free to play the field among the powerful widowed matriarchs of the Roman elite. Hello, Servilia. After finishing his term as praetor with distinction, he was awarded the governorship of northern Spain. The problem was, though, he had gone into ludicrous amounts of debt getting to this point. So much, in fact, that the regular taxes and extortion on his single province wouldn't work. It wouldn't cover all of his debts. So there was only one thing for it. Assemble the Legion of the Region.
Stop before I set the microphone on fire with my fat
boss! And go get some more. For the next 2 years, Caesar went on an absolute rampage against the tribes of northwestern Spain, which had yet to be conquered by the Republic. In a series of devastating victories, he all but destroyed the Gallieci tribe on the field of combat, the largest being a combined land-sea battle at Brigantium, rendering them vassals of Rome. The other tribe, known as the Lusitani, managed to survive Caesar's campaigns, but not without losing most of their stored wealth, funds which the precocious proconsul needed to cover his debts back home. By the winter of 61 BC, Roman legionaries were encamped overlooking the mighty white peaks of the most dangerous natural barrier they'd ever seen. It wasn't the Alps, nor was it even the Pyrenees, but the roaring torrent of the Atlantic Ocean. Gaius Julius Caesar was now master of Hispania Ulterior. Yet as we know, as pretty much everyone knew, this was not his ultimate goal. His ultimate goal was Rome. And so, by 60 BC, he returned home in triumph to the rapturous cheers of the people. However, due to tradition, he could not enter the city under arms until his victories were ratified by the Senate as an official triumph, sanctioned by the gods. If he did enter, it would mean relinquishing his rights to the festival due to him returning as a private citizen and not a general. Now, the reason this was a problem is that he had to submit his candidacy for the consul elections before the electoral season began. Otherwise, he would have to wait another year, as consulships were only year-long terms. Yet even today, all these centuries later, there is still only a 24-hour news cycle, and if he waited too long, the victories he'd won would fade into memory as soon as some other general to the east kills some king somewhere. So, he did what he'd always done. He turned it around. He entered the city alone to announce his candidacy, loudly proclaiming that he would forego his own personal glory for the good of Rome and its people. This was horseshit, by the way. He tried to have both his cake and eat it too, but Cato shot down his request to stand for consul in absentia in the Senate, so he didn't get away with it. Nevertheless, he was still the hero of Hispania, and with all the allies he'd made through the years, victory in the consular election was practically assured. He couldn't possibly lose. And so, 59 BC saw the birth of a new alliance as during the electoral campaign, he reconciled two old political enemies, uniting Crassus's finances and Pompey's status. The first triumvirate was formed, with Caesar taking the role of consul, the crucial linchpin binding it all together. With a combined might of Rome's richest man and Rome's greatest soldier, both supporting Rome's most popular politician, there was no force that could oppose them. And if we are keeping this video's tradition of contemporary political equivalencies, this alliance changed the entire equation from the chaotic impotency of the US Congress to Putin's oligarchic Russia of the mid-2000s. What the triumvirate said went, and there was very little anyone could do about it. Between the three men, they controlled every major facet of Roman society, meaning the conservatives, led by Cato, could only mount limited opposition, and even when they managed a small victory or two, it almost always came at a cost, because the moment they won a victory, Caesar would immediately whip out a populist policy in response, and then force them to argue against it on the principle that the populares are proposing it and therefore it must be bad. And so if they do confront it, they then just put the vote to the tribunes for a referendum, meaning the Optimates then have to stand up in front of the working class Romans and explain to them why land grants for veterans and the urban poor is a bad thing. It goes about as well as you can expect. Multiple conservative senators and Caesar's Optimate co-consul essentially had to go into hiding every time there was a vote because the Roman people would grab the torches and pitchforks. Of course, while all the reforms benefiting the common people of Rome were fantastic and really boosted Caesar's popularity, they were also used to screen all the other things the three men were doing, namely grotesque political corruption. All three men got horrifically rich, or in Crassus's case, richer. They stacked every public office with their puppets, while every single prime posting that came up was handed to one of the three or one of their allies. In the end, however, it would all come to a head within a year, as concurrent terms as consul were forbidden by law, lest they become tyrants, or worse, kings. But it just so happened that the governorships of not just one province, but several, were also coming up for reassignment, and by an amazing coinkydink, they also happened to be on the northern border of the Republic. Oh, whatever shall we do? And so the propaganda began. Savage Gauls coming to murder us. Thracians putting poison in our wine to turn the slaves gay. We have to secure the border and build that wall. Build that wall. Build that... We need to send a strong man up there to handle it. Someone with military experience. Someone with the confidence of the public. Yeah, sure, it will mean giving him more legions and more governorships than the constitutional precedent says he can have, but these are changing times. Hang on a minute. What a coincidence. Doesn't our current consul have all these qualifications? This is a happy, joyous coincidence. Yes. Using the triumvirate's influence, they essentially assigned the entire northern border of Rome, along with all of its legions, to one man. Caesar. This was the coup de grace. Everything he'd done up to this point had been leading to this single moment. Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul, along with Illyria, all of it his, along with the armies to guard them, meaning that he was in command of the single biggest military force in the entire world. Just what could a man do with power like that? Well, we know what a Roman would do, and it turned pretty much every single optimate in the city against him. But what of a post-apocalyptic American? What would he do with it? And how would he even get such power? As the followers' expedition approached the gaping maw of the Grand Canyon, they encountered their first truly wild tribal community. It was time for their mission to start for real. But much to the shock of the well-travelled academics, the tribals could already communicate relatively effectively in common English vernacular. But when Jedward heard their use of Latin loanwords, that shock became curiosity. Asking where they had learned these words, the tribesmen spoke of a visitor they had staying with them, who was teaching his language and telling stories of the great Gaius. Introductions were immediately requested, and it was here Edward Sallow would make the second most important acquaintance of his life. For the man that greeted him was a missionary from New Canaan, who went by the name Joshua Graham. The two men did not have any special rapport per se, nor was there any moment of clarity between them or anything like that. However, there was a glimmer of understanding there. They recognized something in each other. They were two men on a mission. A mission not of understanding or enlightenment, though that's what they claimed it to be, but a mission to spread their respective ideologies throughout the world. Though as they would discover, they had more in common with one another than they realized, especially in their methods. Being skilled in languages and the wasteland being especially dangerous to travel alone, Joshua decided to travel with the expedition into the canyon to contact the first tribe they had planned to meet, the Blackfoot. Jedward and Joshua got to know each other quite well during their journey, primarily due to the fact that as the anthropologist, he would have to know how to speak the languages of the tribes they encountered, which Joshua could speak quite well. It's assumed that here is where Caesar got the beginnings of his education into the tribal languages he would use to demand the submission of so many. And that quest was about to start. When they met the Blackfoot, the meeting started well. Greetings and gifts were exchanged. Discussions were amicable. However, it immediately began to unravel. Joshua Graham, now known as the Burned Man, would later say he has flashbacks to this single moment, the moment where he might, just might, have prevented the calamity about to happen. While Caesar states it was simple, barbaric greed and nothing more. What we do know is that during the discussion with the tribal chief, Joshua phrased a question or response incorrectly with a mistranslation. So much so that it came out as a demand or an insult. Unaware of their transgression, the entire expedition was seized and disarmed, with demands to be made for ransom from the followers. But there was a reason for this desperate act of violence. The Blackfoot at the time were currently locked in tribal warfare with all 7 of their surrounding neighbours. the Kaibabs and the Fredonians being among the most aggressive, having inflicted defeats on them recently. Jedward had pieced together the situation from the various conversations he had had, but after narrowly surviving one of the raids on the encampment, it was then that Caesar had this to say. "It is one thing to be held hostage, quite another to be lashed to a sinking ship." Over the objections of his fellow followers, he and Joshua Graham decided that to save themselves, they would have to win their war for them. And so, like his historical namesake, the true awakening of Caesar as we know him began as a hostage-taking, only to lead to total war. The two men educated the Blackfoot in how to maintain their firearms, how to shoot accurately, how to reload ammunition and make more. Caesar's time in the Great Library of the Boneyard served him in good stead. Preserved during wartime, he had access to all the various US Army manuals available to the draftees and volunteers heading to Alaska. He trained the Blackfoot in small unit tactics, squad attack, support by fire, and how to make improvised explosives. The tribals viewed the men with awe, especially Caesar, who wielded power as though he was a sorcerer. In a near-unanimous decision, they proclaimed him the war chief of the Blackfoot. Now he had his instrument. Now he had power. For the first time in his life, Edward Sallow had a leadership position. For the first time in his life, he, not others, but he, was the master of his fate. And destiny belongs to those who seize it. Following the lessons of his hero, he decided on a strategy of defeat in detail. Divide et impera. Divide and conquer. Selecting their weakest enemy, the Ridges, Caesar led the Blackfoot in an assault on their encampment. With their new weapons and tactics, the Ridges were defeated outright in a pitched battle that lasted less than an hour, ending with a standoff just outside their main living area. The women and children cowering in terror behind the few warriors they had left. Knowing they were defeated, Caesar appeared before them and gave them an ultimatum. They were to submit to the Blackfoot wholesale, integrate with the tribe, abandon their language and culture. They were to commit to total, unconditional surrender. The Ridges refused these terms on principle, for as Caesar relates, they only played at war. A little raiding here, a little pillaging there. They had no concept of what true combat was. And they were about to be taught a lesson. One final lesson. They and all the tribes of the region would receive an education in total warfare. The entire tribe, every man, woman, and child, were murdered. Their bodies dumped in ornamental corpse piles, the leader crucified between them, just as the Romans did before him. He lived in a society, and sometimes you just gotta send a message.
Crucifixion? Yeah, first offence. Get away with crucifixion. It's the best thing the Romans ever did for us.
Crucifixion? Yes. Good. Out of the door, line on the left, one cross each. Next.
When he attacked the Fredonians and later the Kaibabs, he defeated them in the same quick but brutal manner. However, when they refused to surrender, he took an envoy to witness the remains of the Ridges to demonstrate what happens to those who defy him. The sheer terror this instilled caused them to surrender instantly, thus leading to their enslavement as part of the Blackfoot tribe. He followed this process with all 7 tribes in the region, and then proceeded to expand his reach across the Arizona plains, following the same process each and every time. Enter an area, kill or crucify an entire community, and then forcibly integrate their neighbors. As they marched on this campaign of conquest, Caesar steadily indoctrinated the various tribes into his ideology, which he had, obviously, chosen to pattern on Imperial Rome. His reasoning was simple. It was a completely alien society and culture, something no tribal would know about, let alone understand. And so, using the historical model of Romanization and settler colonialism, his idea was based in the concept that the fundamental cultural differences between different tribes naturally spawned conflict. Therefore, like another leader from what his predecessor would call Germania, he needed to create the concept of the the Legion, a monolithic, hegemonic culture, a triumph of his will, as it were. A nationalist, imperialist, totalitarian, homogenous culture that obliterates the identity of everyone it conquers, with the ultimate goal of creating a Pax Romana, or Roman peace. Therein lies Caesar's ultimate objective, his answer to humanity's future. Everywhere throughout his life he has found diversity, whether it be cultural, biological, ethnic, ideological, or even class, and rather than marveling at its strange beauty or indulging the curiosity to learn more about these differences, he felt nothing but disgust at those he considered inferior. In his mind, wherever that diversity had been found, it led to conflict, violence, and destruction, caused at the hands of moronic barbarians, the greatest consequence of which is the blasted, irradiated hellscape which he and everyone else has been forced to inhabit. In the scientist Charles Darwin, in the philosophers of the Frankfurt School, in the histories of humanity's varied struggles, he has found his answer. He has found the answer to the dialectic. As long as mankind remains fragmented into all these different identities, ideologies, cultures, as long as they have no universal community to belong to, as long as they have no common single purpose or goal, they will descend into discord, which will lead to the mistakes of the past. A synthesis must be found, a common identity must be forged, and it will be forged with iron and blood. The followers had sent him out here to bring the torch of civilization to the wastes. However, as he smiled to himself on the day of his proclamation as Caesar, he vowed he would take the torch part of the mission very literally. Learning from his historical counterpart, he knew the power of religion, proclaiming himself the son of Mars, instilling in his warriors the fervor of crusaders, spreading their civilization in the name of the god of war under the leadership of his heir on earth. And their first sacrifice to Mars would be the remaining followers who had watched all this unfold with horror. Before their mangled bodies had gone cold, he spared the last survivor, Bill Calhoun, as the bearer of his proclamation westwards. "Do not interfere with me or my legion, lest there be consequences." From there, his life once again mirrored his historical counterpart. As Gaius Julius crushed all the Gallic tribes who raised their swords against Rome, so did Jedward Caesar to the tribes of Arizona and New Mexico. From the Great Plains to the Salt Lakes, integrating and annexing every single one. Among these tribes was the Twisted Hares, a tribe marked out by their practice of wearing dreadlocks. They met their fate at the hands of a cohort led by Vulpe Inculta, who spotted a young warrior of great promise in their ranks. For his legion name, this warrior would choose the name Ulysses. Another tribe, named the Hydebarks, proved much harder to conquer, requiring the presence of Caesar himself to accomplish. Legionaries surviving battles against the Hydebarks told tale of a warrior, 7 feet tall, impossible to kill, who had wiped out entire patrols single-handedly. In a costly but well-executed battle, Caesar defeated this belligerent tribe, forcing them to surrender. All except the giant himself, who upon hearing his chief submit, began slaughtering the men beside him, deriding them as filthy cowards. It took an entire contubernium of troops to take him down, ripping his face off in the process. But this warrior did not die, for Caesar had learned something else from his role model. Judicial use of mercy makes powerful allies. This warrior would become Legatus Lanius, who in exchange for murdering the cowards of his tribe would pledge loyalty to the legion. Caesar offered him the adult men, with the boys to be trained as legionnaires. As we know, he took that offer, and Caesar would prove time and time again that he had an excellent eye for talent. Decanus Red Sea from the Sundogs, Centurion Gaius Magnus from the Painted Rock, but the most capable of all was Joshua Graham, who served as the first legate of the legion. Under his command, from 2247 until 2277, the legion expanded its reach across the wasteland, eventually conquering 86 tribes in all. But a tribal confederation does not an empire make.
Unless you are, wait for it, the Mongols.
But Caesar doesn't want anyone to know about that, especially these guys. Besides, creating beef jerky by riding horses is inferior to wearing togas and vomiting, apparently, which proves this motherfucker has a brain tumor. In any case, Caesar's mission is reform. It's not an empire he wants. He doesn't think that small. What he wants is to build a civilization. His experience and knowledge of the NCR under President Tandy, as well as the high quality of life for his non-tribal subjects under his rule, acts as a proof of concept that a benevolent dictatorship can work. But he's built it with warrior tribes, and much like another emperor in the grim, dark future of the post-apocalypse, he knows you can't build a civilization on the backs of barbaric killing machines alone. You need to have a structure. What you need is a society. His legion is currently a nomadic war tribe larping as Romans, while having none of the laws, civic structures, or what can even be recognized as a citizenry. Their economic structure, while beneficial for most of their subjects, is a tribute-based system, closer to the Mongols or a feudal kingdom, rather than an empire with laws and a governing bureaucracy. They have no codified regulations nor a form of representation. And while this works for now, Caesar knows that this is not a tenable long-term solution. His capital city of Flagstaff, Arizona is comparable to one of the out-of-state capitals of the NCR, but it isn't a Shady Sands, and it certainly isn't New Vegas. But that is where he finds his answer. He can't build a civilization with the materials he has, but perhaps he can annex and integrate one. Rome became a great civilization by overcoming its great rival Carthage. It gained virtue after Caesar crushed the fragmented corruption of the Senate, laying the foundation for Augustus's Pax Romana. In the NCR, he finds both a great enemy and a corrupt republic. If he can defeat the NCR on the field of battle and annex it wholesale, he will be able to adapt its organized civic framework into his ideological worldview, with the Legion supplanting the NCR armed forces as a professional military, his own brand of the Marian reforms. His subjects would become imperial citizens, governed by laws and bureaucrats, all of it under a hereditary dictatorship appointed by Caesar himself. He draws this conclusion from his understanding of the Hegelian strain of philosophers, though, as I stated before, his understanding is closer to the fundamentals of German philosophy rather than Hegel himself. His use of thesis and antithesis resulting in synthesis isn't even Hegelian, it's simply a conjecture of his time from the philosopher Fichte. As I said earlier in a rather ironic twist, what Caesar is actually doing is far closer to a flawed version of Marxist dialectical materialism, because Hegel focuses much more on spiritualism and idealism as driving forces, the idea and ideologies and concepts of men themselves. Caesar, meanwhile, appears to take a more Marxist view, in that it is the material world itself that defines the relations between ideas, ideologies, cultures, and at their core, human beings themselves. Where he diverges from Marx, though, is that while socialists and communists view the abolition of material inequity combined with the removal of the systems that cause it as the solution, fascists, Caesar included, view instead that social Darwinism is the answer. The weak are killed off, while only the strong survive, and in that strength, in that survival, they find virtue. Instead of altering the material conditions at their cores and resolving the dialectic to improve the lives of everyone, Caesar wants to create a society able to overcome the struggles caused by those conditions, by wiping out those he considers unworthy, while forcibly creating a Volk, a unified homogeneous culture unaffected by the degraded material conditions. A group that venerates an ideal and strives to it, while casting out or destroying all those who do not conform to it, thereby justifying the militaristic existence they inhabit. They are an inherently reactionary ideology. Their mission is to spread civilization, as it were, all while acting in self-defense, or for the betterment of mankind. And in this, he is learning directly from the culture he so admires, unsurprisingly, as Calgacus, the Caledonian chieftain quoted by Tacitus, said most profoundly. The Romans, from whose oppression escape is vainly sought by obedience and submission, the robbers of the world, having by their universal plunder exhausted the land, they rifle the deep. If the enemy be rich, they are rapacious. If he be poor, they lust for dominion. Neither the East nor the West has been able to satisfy them. Alone among men, they covet with equal eagerness poverty and riches. To robbery, slaughter, plunder, they give the lying name of empire. They make a solitude, they make a desert, and call it peace. Caesar is a reactionary through and through, a situation not helped by his brain tumour. And that in of itself is an interesting comparison to his historical counterpart as well, because even this tumour, a central plot point of the game, is directly linked to Gaius Julius himself. Scholarship is still bitterly divided on what exactly the illness that afflicted him was. The traditional assessment has been epilepsy, but others have contended anything from microsieges to a tumour. In fact, it may even be a joint reference to both Gaius Julius Caesar and Caligula, given that the Mad Emperor is suspected to have suffered a similar condition, either a tumour or encephalitis. Again, scholarship is divided here beyond the circumstantial evidence of seizures and migraines to a larger degree. What is beyond dispute is they definitely suffered some sort of affliction or neurological condition that often affected their decisions. But whatever the case, it did not swerve the legion from its course. Caesar had gained enough strength, forged an army of terrifying size and capability. Like Gaius Julius before him, it was time to march back to his home, a home he had not seen for many years, and enact the reforms it so desperately needs. Dispatching the Frumentari ahead of the main body, it would be none other than Ulysses, trainer of the Whitelegs, future master of the Divide, that discovered Hoover Dam. And just to its east were the first signs of NCR encampments, the distant outposts of the Republic, the closest being Fort Aradesh, named for the NCR's first president, near the settlement of Malpai. Under the able command of Legatus Graham, the Legion declared war with their customary brutality, swiftly destroying the fort along with almost everyone in it. The few survivors were left alone so they could escape and spread the horrors of what they'd experienced, granting Joshua the title of the Malpai Legate in his victory. Legion scouts and ranging patrols would skirmish with NCR rangers all along the Colorado River as Frumentari infiltrated as far as the New Vegas Strip itself, telling Caesar of the wonders it contained. It was then he decided that the Colorado would be his Rubicon. Once crossed, there was no going back. He would take New Vegas as his Rome, his new capital, and destroy the Republic, building a new empire in its wake, an empire to last 1,000 years, a Pax Romana. And the rest is, as they say, history. You all know the story from here. You've played the game or seen HBO's Rome. You know how this goes. The first battle of Hoover Dam resulted in defeat for the Legion, as Joshua Graham's assault was lured into a trap at Boulder City by Hanlon's Rangers. The Malpai Legate was replaced with a new title, the Burned Man, as Joshua was soaked in pitch and set alight, his carcass tossed into the Grand Canyon, only for him to rise again, baptized in flame. The Legion would be taken by Lanius on campaign to the east to subjugate more tribes and rebuild their strength, their training drums echoing over the Colorado. Gaius Julius Caesar, meanwhile, waged war in Gaul, launched an expedition to Britain, and crushed Vercingetorix in his great victory at Alesia, the famous double-wall fortress. He would, as we know, and for the final time, march on Rome, to defeat his rivals in the Senate, led by Pompey Magnus. After waging war all across the Mediterranean, up and down the Italian peninsula, all the way through Spain, it eventually culminated in the dramatic Battle of Pharsalus on the plains in Greece, where outnumbered and outgunned, or I guess outsworded, Caesar routed the Republic's army and finished the Second Roman Civil War as its triumphant victor. If I were to draw one last comparison between the two men, it would be the reformist nature of both of their dictatorships, and the two men's ultimate goals. Like Jedward, Caesar knew that his society was unsustainable in its current form. After his victory in the civil wars, he knew that Rome had to change in order to survive. The constant changes in power, the one-year consulships, they never allowed for any meaningful political reforms to stick, while on the extreme other end of the spectrum, the level of corruption enabled by a lack of term limits for non-elector positions was absolutely obscene. I wonder where we've seen that before. And so, while proclaiming himself dictator and stacking the Senate with his allies, given that a lot of his rivals, died in the Civil War, he showed incredible mercy and leniency, offering amnesty to all but his most dangerous of enemies. He expanded citizenship rights to all of Italy, while allowing every province in the empire to start earning citizenship through distinguished service to the state. During his senatorial reforms, he even allowed naturalized citizens from outer provinces, mostly his old governed provinces, who by now had been Romanized to hold office in the Senate, and represent the northern regions of the Republic themselves. Now, yes, this did serve Caesar's goals, as they were only there because Caesar allowed them to be, and therefore they were all loyal to him. But with their support, his reforms were met with incredible acclaim from the populace. Pensions and land grants to veterans of the legions, both his and even his rivals, acknowledging them as servants of Rome all. He passed welfare reforms, grain doles, and even a once-off stipend of the plunder that he had seized through his campaigns in Gaul. Infrastructure projects, electoral reforms, restructured the court system, set term limits for governors and senior appointee positions, and perhaps most incredibly of all, labor reforms, limiting the number of slaves per paid employee to ensure plebeians always had enough work. Caesar laid the bedrock of the transition from a representative tributary republic to a true continent-spanning empire. He increased the standard of living for the average Roman considerably, and his senatorial colleagues murdered him for it. You see, while he was benevolent for the most part, Caesar was still a dictator. His political maneuvering was so masterful, his PR department so effective, that he was practically unchallenged in anything that happened in Rome. And while the people may have loved him, their benefits came at the cost of the top 1%. Just as the Amazons and BlackRocks of today have lobbyists, so did the Romans. The Optimates had their land compulsorily purchased for the veterans' pensions. Higher property taxes on them paid for the reforms and the welfare balances. The labor reforms, limiting slave employment, severely cut into their bottom line. But worst of all, foreigners, and worse still, average people were being allowed to stand for tribune positions and, gods forbid, senatorial rank? This stole their most prized possession, their elite privileged status. They had lost their class superiority. And this is why dictators are never a good thing. And as we know from later Roman history, the precedent set by Caesar would eventually spell disaster when someone not as benevolent or competent took power. But don't mistake his assassination as a true tyrannicide by oppressed individuals. It would be as if Russia's oligarchs had backed Prigo during his mad dash to Moscow and took power themselves. We haven't seen a glorious victory for the common man. It was just one group of power-hungry rich guys killing another group of power-hungry rich guys. So, before his epilepsy or brain tumor could, the Optimates killed him. And it was et tu brutal, with 23 stab wounds of varying severity, sending the former Pontifex Maximus to answer to his old bosses. And as for Caesar of the Wastes, well, we don't know how his reforms will go. We don't know whether he'll succeed or not. His armies are definitely poised for victory, that we do know. The NCR we see in-game can't possibly hope to defeat his numbers or their morale. With superior tactics and overall better strategic position, the only variable is Caesar's health and whether a cure for his condition can be found. But as with everyone in Vegas, he is here to gamble. As on the banks of a river once more, a phrase is uttered. Alea iacta est. The die is cast. It is up to the fortunes and the fates to decide how humanity continues. Though of all the outcomes he considered or foresaw, like his own rise to power, absolutely no one could have foretold that the course of history would not be determined by the great men of the age. Not by House, not by Caesar, not by Kimball, nor General Oliver, but by a single, determined postal worker, on a quest for neither wealth nor power, but the most important thing of all. They are on a quest for an answer. If nothing else could be taken away from this story, it shows the same immortal truth that we've always known. It's embodied in the very men we have discussed today. Though they are separated by thousands of years as well as fiction and fact, their lives, their actions, and their destinies draw the same inexorable, inevitable conclusion. Because war never changes.